Hi, everyone from McKinney, which is in North Texas, and hello from a wonderful group of SAQA quilters in North Texas, several of whom are chimed in today. My first slide shows the quilt that made it into Musica and also shows the photograph on which the quilt is based. Most of my friends call this my guitar quilt, but I named it San Antonio on my mind because the photograph was taken in San Antonio's vibrant marketplace 2 years ago when SAQA held its big international conference there. I've been an avid photographer for many years, so quite a few of my quilts are based on photographs, but I'm going to show you next some quilts that are not based on photographs. Many of us quilters make quilts because we want to celebrate what's bright and beautiful and fun, but other times I think we have to contend with what we need to get off our chests. And these are two totally improvisational pieces where I was dealing with something on my chest. The piece on the left, which is as much a book or a scroll as it is a quilt, was created at the time of the Deepwater Horizon oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico. The one on the right remains a favorite of mine, and I think it is a favorite because there's something about the way the raw, rough, hand-dyed fabric and the wild hand stitching contrast with the very even machine stitching on the green silk. And those two, that contrast of those two things somehow or another captures the way chaos broke through order on that very tragic day at Sandy Hook Elementary School. The next slide shows two more pieces that I suppose could be classified as activist works. The one on the left was created at the time of the Las Vegas massacre. I couldn't take myself away from the news, so I grabbed a piece of canvas that I had from Home Depot and a bunch of pens and started writing down the words of all of the commentators and reporters. So the quilt background includes everything from the words of the Second Amendment to words like carnage. As the canvas filled up and I had smaller and smaller spaces to write, I began to record sentences from magazine articles. One of the sentences on the quilt talks about a victim of the massacre, and it says simply, "He was walking toward the stage to hear his favorite song." The kimono on the right was created just last fall for Dallas area fiber artists' recycled runway show. It is made entirely of drapery and upholstery scraps or samples, I should say, from an interior design studio. The two halves of the front contrast a sick planet with a well planet. And on the back of the kimono are the very brave words of young Greta Thunberg when she challenged world leaders in New York at a meeting of the UN. The next slide does take us to quilts that are inspired by photographs. Not long after I took Susie Monday's Art on the iPad for Quilters class, I was playing around with a photograph from a cookbook, a pear cookbook. And when my app turned the background black and the fruit red, I suddenly thought, oh, I think I can make a quilt out of that. So that quilt has been shown quite a few times in quite a few places with the permission of the photographer of the pear. The quilt on the right is not based on iPad manipulation at all. That's simply a photograph that I took at the Dallas Arboretum many years ago, and I always loved the shapes and the contrasts. So when SAQA announced its upcycle exhibit, I dug into a bin full of old blue jeans and old faded denim shirts, and this was the outcome. The next slide shows you Texas Boy with Fish, based on a photograph of my grandson with his first big fish. I loved the silhouette, the backlighting, the gesture of holding up the big fish. So I played with it on my iPad, and you can see on the right the result that I got on one occasion with my iPad, and decided at that point, okay, I can make a quilt out of this. And then as you look at the finished quilt, you can see that I continued to have fun with things like the decorative stitching on my machine. The next slide shows you a very tiny quilt, which had its 10 minutes of fame in San Antonio at that same SAQA conference. Willow the Armadillo was in the spotlight auction in San Antonio, and she went for $900, which was a tremendous thrill for me. She's not based on a photograph. Instead, she's based on an iPad drawing that I had made for a totally different purpose. That's in the upper right-hand corner. And then in the left corner, you can see an iPad version that did not become a quilt and probably won't ever become a quilt, but I included it here to show you what fun can be had with iPad manipulation of your various images. The next slide takes you to my largest quilt to date. Elba Isle Hancock, which honors my maternal grandmother, is 6 feet tall by 2 feet wide. It was made for the Celebration of Women exhibit in Houston a couple of years ago, but it's gone on to a number of other shows and some really nice honors. And the picture on the right was taken last fall at San Diego's beautiful Visions Art Museum, where she was a part of their interpretation show. The next slide takes you to my work area. That table with pipe legs was created for me by my son-in-law, and it is quite literally the center of my universe. If you had a picture of it at Christmas Eve this last Christmas, you would have found it loaded with Christmas dishes and food and surrounded by chairs and family. And I do have another table in another part of the house, but this is the one where the light is right and where I quilt a lot. My grandchildren are college age now, so I can go many days without having to clean this up and make room for anyone else to come and eat. The folding table on the right does not always sit in that passageway to the patio door. It comes in from the garage when a project is especially large or complicated. And that chopping block on wheels actually lives about 6 paces to the left in the center of my kitchen. But I rolled it into this photograph because it is used as much for chopping fabric as it is for chopping vegetables. We'll go through those double doors to the next slide, which is where most of my stash is kept. It's not ever this neat, but I do clean house for company, and you guys are the first company I've had since January, with the exception of my daughter. You can sort of get the feel for how this mess all can come up, how it can be used. The baskets on the top contain things like ribbons and lace, and the ones down below contain PFD fabric, batting, and things like that. On the wall further along, you can see where I store large sheets of paper for book binding. They're draped over old-fashioned curtain rods. The next slide takes you to where I sew. There's no long arm here, just a relatively young Juki and a 65-year-old Elna that comes out of its container once in a while. It still purrs and I still love it. This is a corner of my guest bedroom. So when an out-of-town guest comes, a few baskets get shoved around to make room for suitcases, and it serves that purpose too. The tabletop along the window wall is actually a hollow core door that is padded and covered with fabric to be a fusing and ironing surface. And the door is so lightweight that I can actually lift it off and carry it into that first room that you saw if I need to use it on that folding table and have a surface that I can walk all the way around. The next slide takes us back to the guitar quilt and shows you a little bit of the process. The image that's sitting on an angle is the iPad image that I settled on as my inspiration. I blew it up in Photoshop to the size I wanted the quilt to be. I took it to my FedEx where they have one of those giant printers that you can use yourself, and printed what could be regarded as a full-size pattern for the quilt. You can see how I have outlined with Sharpie pen on plastic the main outlines of the quilt so that I had something to guide me as I assembled the various components of the quilt. If you look at the two colored images in the bottom row of guitars on those two, you will see that I was changing my mind about what colors I wanted the actual quilt guitars to be. And you can see, because there's one guitar still missing, along with a few other pieces, that I had not made up my mind what color I wanted the guitar under the white guitar to be. The last slide shows you what color I chose for that missing guitar. It also shows you some of the detailed stitching on the quilt. And in the upper right-hand corner, you can see a totally different iPad version of that same photograph, which I'm now enjoying printing on linen and using on greeting cards. So these guitars help me hear mariachi music, and I hope that quilt helps you hear the same.